Welcome to How the Pod. My name is Heidi Harman. This is the place where we pick the brains of changemakers about tech and society. So this episode is in partnership with progressdata.io, a research-based tool for HR managers to measure what matters when it comes to gender and diversity, pay gap, and creating parity reports with actionable improvement suggestions. That's progressdata.io. Ph.D. Emma Heikensten is one of Sweden's few researchers on diversity and economic decision-making. With a Ph.D. from Stockholm School of Economics and several years at Harvard, she's also one of the brains behind Ownershift, a think tank that was created by her and a small group of women using evidence-based research to showcase financial inequality. With stats and graphs, she and her colleagues visualize how money is power and freedom to decide, and also the ability to follow your dreams on a practical level. So Ownershift has compiled 2 reports. The first one poses the super uncomfortable question, which is who owns Sweden? And in a country like Sweden that is known for its gender equality, it posed a very different picture with numbers. The second report, titled Why Do Women Not Own as Much as Men? She went over 300 research papers in a meta-study to answer that important question. With the reports, Emma and Ownershift have basically explored the importance of ownership and the existing inequalities. And she's here today to tell us a bit more about that and actually how bad the situation is. So not only do we have a doctor who's conducted research at some of the world's top universities, she's also known to scrutinize Sweden's open data. And today she's practically exploring the banking sector and is now working with some of these issues and other sustainability issues that are close to her heart. A big warm welcome to you, Emma.
Thank you.
So, do you want to tell me a bit about how you got into Ownershift? How did this entire adventure of yours emerge?
So it's actually a pretty funny story. I contacted Linda Wexin, who's one of the founders, in the spring of 2018 because she had this company and I was interested in looking at her data. At the same time, I contacted you for the same reasons. She did not have any data to share at the time, and very quickly we started talking about other issues and came into gender differences in ownership. A week later, I had dinner with her and about 5 other women. There was a lawyer, an angel investor, people who've been working in PR for a long time and who've had important leadership roles in their respective areas. Quite quickly, we decided that we wanted to work on ownership together to explore the possibility of an ownershift. We decided that we wanted to work with activities that would have an impact and decided to first measure what the situation looked like and then start working in a research-based manner to change the numbers.
So should we jump into the first report? Who owns Sweden? Who owns Sweden?
It's not the women. It's basically ownership is twice as high among men as among women. In sort of on an overall, if you have an overall perspective on private ownership, we went through a bunch of different areas. We tried to cover, everything that we could find, basically. So we look at properties, we look at land, we look at different natural resources like agriculture and forests. We also look at cars. We take a dive into savings and then also try to look at some dimension of owning companies. And this twice as much sort of result, it's actually pretty consistent in all of these different areas. So it's, about between maybe 30 and 35, 38% female ownership within these areas. So then, almost twice as much or half as much as men.
And so the differences are about men own twice as much as women across the board, give or take.
Yes.
And if you want exact details, you can basically go to the report to see them. But so how is this? I mean, we of course have historical reasons for this, which in both negative and positive aspects impact of how and where we are today. How would you, in a simple manner, tell us a bit about that?
So I actually have a great tip here. I am currently working at SEB, the bank, and we made a movie on March 8th, International Women's Day, where we try to sort of, in an easy manner, explain why we have these gender differences as we do. And it takes a historical perspective on this, where we see that in the 1800s, women were first allowed to inherit wealth. But then it took another 50 to 100 years before women were allowed to have a bank account. So it was very hard to, work with that wealth.
Yeah.
These laws have impacted the norms that we have today and has made strong marks in how we behave. But I would really recommend you to watch the movie.
Yeah, I'm going to link it below, as of course the reports as well. And it's really interesting, right? Because if you can inherit and your brother will inherit everything that your parents worked for, of course, if that consequently continues, of course you're going to end up not owning as much as the others.
Sure, and the thing is though, there are laws that prohibits parents only choosing their sons to inherit. But if you don't have the same wage as your brother, for example, the brother might be able to keep this wealth and to work with it. Sort of, talking about a summer house, for example. If you inherit a summer house together with someone, and that someone wants to rebuild it, for example, and you can't afford that, then maybe you have to sell it or feel like you have to sell it to that person. And that sort of creates this gap in ownership over time.
That is so interesting. And then at some point, women were also not allowed to work. You were not allowed to dispose of your own income, even if you happen to have it.
So today we have a wage gap of about 11%. 30, 40 years ago, the wage gap was even higher, maybe 30%. And if you have less money than someone over time, that person can invest their money. And given, the growth of the stock markets, if that person invested, 30% or 10% of their wage a while ago, those assets would today have grown, 10 times or something. So it's really about getting money, investing money over time.
So, okay, we understand that women own less, but the norms and the behaviors take us into the report, why do women not own as much as men? So how come this is? Do you want to tell me a bit more about that?
Yes, I think it's a very important question to ask, and I think that's the sort of the starting point of finding what measures to use to actually impact these numbers, to change, to have the shift. We in the research group of Ownershift have found sort of 3 main areas which we think are most important. The first one is about the norms. It contains reasons and research concerning norms and stereotypes, gender-based discrimination, and social networks and role models. All of these topics are interconnected, and they sort of all belong within the norm area.
So for the people who haven't been exposed to the word norm, could you tell me a bit about that?
Absolutely. So norms are rules that we act by. They're not rules as they're sort of stated in our regulations, they could be, but they are more related to how we act on an everyday basis. And in terms of gender, it's often about what we do as women and what we do as men, and how we act, and what feelings we're allowed to feel, what clothes we wear.
Or that you're allowed to ask for more money during your negotiation, perhaps.
Absolutely. That could be norm-based as well. And I think it's sort of important to understand that in Sweden, at least, norms are not determined by law, but they are definitely impacted by our laws and by our historic laws. But in Sweden, it's more subtle, but still impacting all of us.
So the norms are not law, but they still impact us in our everyday life.
Yes, it's about who takes out the trash. It's about who get your kids dressed in the morning. It's about who takes care of the dishes. It's all of those things that happens. It's also about whether you wear a helmet or not when you ride a bike, right? That's not something that's governed by law. It's something that people do. And it also relates to status and, the stuff that we want to abide by, although we're not sort of punished if we don't in a sort of formal way, even though norm breaking is often punished in an informal way.
So one could also state that then there's no reason but norms why women aren't saving and owning more.
In some way you could say that. Norms really are there in all of these areas that we do take up, and it's a reason for why those areas exist. On the other hand, we also have a pay gap. So even if all norms today would be sort of, all gender norms would just vanish, we would still, have a pay gap today. And the pay gap, it maybe drives the norms. And, labor market segregation clearly drives norms. When women sort of go into areas like more caring sort of services within society and so on, and men goes into finance, that also pushes the norm further.
So you and I have discussed a few of these norms, and of course we won't be able to dive deeply into all of them today. But I know that you and I have discussed women's, for example, confidence not always being as high as men's, which the first time I heard it, I was like, oh, what do you mean? I can do everything that men can do, and, nobody's going to tell me what I can and can't do, which in one sense, in a philosophical way, is like a beautiful way at looking at life. Oh, this is what I want to go create. But then science actually proves something different.
Yes, there are a lot of studies showing that women rate their abilities lower than men does on an average level, even though that they perform equal in the task that they're sort of asked about.
And what's the consequence of that?
So, I would say that there are multiple consequences of that. So, one could be, and it's obviously then situation-based as well. If you go into a negotiation and say that I normally do 80% correct, then, your evaluation would be based on your own sort of measure of your own ability. And if a man would go in and I do 99% correct, then he's obviously rated higher and would then, gain a better position or a salary. So that's sort of in the negotiation moment, right? But it's also the fact that you might not want to go into an activity at all because you think that you will not perform as well as your competitors or people around you.
So you have 100% less chance of even getting there.
It's not 100% less a chance. In general, both men and women are overconfident. So people usually think that they're better than they are, but men think that they're even better. So, we are all biased, and overconfidence is a bias that most people do suffer from, let's say. And I don't even know if it's supposed to be suffer, because you're probably happier believing that you can do everything.
Yeah.
And as a man, then you can do everything and somewhat more.
Yeah. So, of course, I've been reading these reports, but I also found another number that really startled me, which was that most women that get a divorce in Stockholm, Sweden today can't afford to buy a one-bedroom apartment. And, of course, not even more if they were so to have children. And this is because women earn about, 4/5 or 3/4 of what the man does. And then I was looking at the stats and I saw that men own over the threshold of what the bank will give you a loan for. Let's say that you're getting a one-bedroom apartment. So that in itself leads me to thinking that us having a lower salary and saying, oh, I can do 80% rather than, my accuracy rate is 99%. Over time will compound. Like the less wage you get, or if you don't ask for what you should have given confidence, you basically will lose out on an apartment at the end of your life. The value of a one-bedroom apartment at the end of your life. Being a woman, not thinking about these things.
Yeah, I think it's very important to, especially if you're in a relationship, right, that you do divide sort of the household-related work, whatever that might be, between you in a way that both make you be able to do your work full-time or to gain money, spend the equal amount of hours gaining money from whatever, work you do, but also split up household chores like childcare and spend as much time on understanding your private economy. So investing in stocks, like saving for your pension. Both men and women needs to know how to do this. Even if you're in a relationship. I mean, most, or not most, but I don't know, 50% of marriages end in a divorce. And in that case, you need to be able to handle savings. So we have 3 main areas in the report. It's the man as the normal, many small streams, and catch-22. So within the first area, we start by discussing norms and stereotypes, which sort of lays out the groundwork as we have discussed. Both norms and stereotypes pushes us into behaving in a way and considering what others do, sort of being inside our usual framework or being outside.
And is that because we want to belong to the group because that's what's going to keep us alive basically during the long winter?
Absolutely. Norms and stereotypes are very much evolutionary in some sense. We need to categorize to be able to understand different situations quickly. So it's completely normal to be based, to have your behavior being norm-based or to base your decision on stereotypes. And we really have to work on not being affected by stereotypes, for example, in our decision making. The best way to do this is actually to design organizations and processes in a way that reduces the impact of the stereotype in the decision making.
And how would you do that?
I mean, the very, very simple way would be to, not have names and pictures on CVs, for example.
Mm-hmm. Which we kind of don't in Sweden.
Sure.
Or no, we don't have pictures, but we do have names.
Yeah.
Right, because then you can sort out, this person, that sounds like somebody I would not want to interview, or I'll just choose this name, it sounds better.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't even do that in a conscious manner. You do it unconsciously. And that sort of leads us directly into this discrimination, right? So unconsciously you discriminate because you have these categorizations of people. You think that, people who have studied certain topic are in a certain way, and you might think that they don't really belong to your setting or the teams that you work with, for example. And then you might discriminate against them even though they might be the perfect fit on a competence level. And here clearly there are gender-based discriminatory actions in society. There are also age-based and discrimination based on ethnicity and so on. And the first step is to acknowledge that we all make decisions that are based on stereotypes. And then the next step is to do something about the processes and design the organizations so that we, are less prone to discriminate, for example. And then thirdly, also very much, within the norm area, are social networks and role models. When we do categorize people and ourselves, we find, networks, people that we spend time with, and we discuss things that are usually discussed within those type of networks. So this is another sort of part of also part of the solution. If we want to own more, or if we want to know more about how to start a company, how to own property, how to invest in stocks, we probably need to spend time with people who also want to go in this direction. And we need to talk about these things. Otherwise, we will never sort of learn about them. And it's also nice to have role models that can, be your sort of where you want to, like your goal, right? It's easier to do things if you have a goal, and a role model can sort of help you with that.
And today, we basically have more tools than ever. We got Facebook groups on shareholding, got mailing lists you can take part of. There is so much out there. So even if you live further away from larger societies, you're basically you still have the access to the internet and you can inform yourself.
Yes, I'm following a lot of different people on Instagram and other social medias that are investing in shares, for example. So I've just started doing that, and I think that's a great way to get inspired and, to see how people do their analysis. And I love also when they're open with their, not failures maybe, but when it doesn't go as well as they would have hoped, right? So you see that not every day and even not every year, is a sunshine story on the stock market. And that's not how it's supposed to be. And then we have the next part, which we call Many Small Streams, which is about the pay gap. And it's also about gender segregation on the labor market. So the pay gap, we have said, it's 11% today. It was even higher going back in time. And, if we control for sort of labor market segregation, for example, it diminishes in size, but 11% is still the gap that we have.
Could you explain that a bit more for people who don't understand what that is?
Sure. So On average, women in Sweden today own 10 or 11% less in wages than men. Some of this is because women work in industries where wages are lower. So if you control for that, the number sort of becomes, or that this 11% number, it becomes smaller, right? Another part of it is because women do spend more time on childcare. So then you lose somewhat more money, right? And another part is that women do not have as sort of high positions in the hierarchies of the companies or the institutions. So if you're a boss, you might earn more than sort of a worker, right? And all of these different aspects are then important contributors to this pay gap. And we find that the labor market segregation in itself, it's also important because it's one of the sort of starting points, I would say. If we want more women to work in finance, for example, that needs to start probably in their education. So you need to sort of look at younger age groups. And then quite naturally we come into financial literacy and numeracy, which also influence financial decision making. And here we find that the research tells us that there is that you often find a gender gap in financial literacy and numeracy. And this is really something worrying, I think, and something that we really need to work on together with the educational institutions in Sweden.
And when you say financial literacy and numeric literacy, are we speaking about understanding math, or is there a wider range of things to be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, it's the combination of math and social science in one sense, right? You need to be able to understand the language that has to do with savings and economics and so on, but you also need to have sort of a basic math knowledge, understanding percentages and interest rates and so on, so be able to sort of govern your own economy. And I really think that this is something that we need to teach our kids in an early age, and probably have it as a topic that comes up every year during school. And then our final part, we call it catch-22. Often when people discuss why we do have a gender gap in society, it comes back to the woman. So what can women do to own more? What does women do wrong? Why aren't women pushing themselves enough? Why aren't they expressing their confidence as high as men? The thing is that together with the norms, changing this behavior can lead to a catch-22. So, if you're a woman and you're acting really confidently, or if you're being bossy, you can be viewed as mean or not nice to spend time with, or even full of yourself. While a man would then be viewed as talented or ambitious and tough, maybe.
And there was a study on this, right?
There are plenty of studies.
Yeah, I remember this one. Yeah.
So, for example, if you do express yourself in a way that's sort of not in accordance with your norms, you might receive sort of a social backlash. You might not be able to get the position that you wanted because you're viewed as then, not nice or whatever that might be.
So the norms are basically, for women, the norm is passive assertive, and the norm for a man is assertive aggressive. Or is that a simplifying it way too much?
Yeah, I mean, it's a simplifying way, but I think it explains the situation pretty well anyway. And I think it's the same if you go into, risk behavior and so on, that we have this norm that women maybe should not take as much risk when it comes to her money, because the women needs to be sort of the safe zone within the family,
the caretakers.
Yeah, exactly. And this also influences then the final outcome,
but isn't
which is then ownership in some sense.
Yeah,
right?
and I mean, to me that sounds really bananas, because it's also proven that women are over time better at investing money and taking more calculated risks and earning more money over time. No?
No.
No.
I mean, but it's not the other way around either. So it's, but I mean, you have probably read one study, but there are many studies, and different studies shows somewhat different results. So, I mean, they have probably done their best to do their study, and then someone else has shown a result going in a different directions. And that's why it's interesting to do this meta studies that we have done, in this report, basically, to try to find sort of where do we have consistent results. And I wouldn't dare to say that either women or men are better investors on a sort of general level, no.
So I would like to say thank you to Helio. It's been a pleasure. They've been hosting us in their podcast studio. It is an amazing meeting place. They have meeting rooms. It's stunningly beautiful, beautiful Swedish design. We've got amazing service. They're kind. It's super central. They have a location in Grevetorgatan 30, but also in 6 other locations around Stockholm. If you need a meeting room for a business meeting, that is where I would suggest you to look. A big thank you to helio.se. So Emma, what are we going to do about this?
It's a very good question. And I think what's interesting about it is that everyone could actually contribute. So you can contribute if you have a role as a manager. Then you can work actively with role models to show that everyone, regardless of their background, can succeed in your company, for example. That would then help reduce the stereotype of only white men being able to become bosses, for example. But it will also influence the pay gap, right? And if you're a parent, it's very important that you teach your daughters to handle their economy just as much, or maybe even more, as your sons. If you're an investor, a good way forward is to explore whether there are parts of your selection processes that could be anonymized or standardized. Could you search for potential entrepreneurs to invest in new ways? Could you find, more women, more people with a sort of different background than you usually do in some way? That would be then helping out sort of the shift in a very real and impactful way.
Yeah, what are the benefits of ownership and a more equal distribution of assets? I'm thinking for a couple, for example.
On a couple level, I would say that, studies show that if you do split up parental leave more equal, you stay together longer, and especially if you're a woman with a career. But I would rather stick to sort of the societal level, and where it is very important for the private individual to be able to get a divorce, and for that you need to make sure that you have your sort of economy set, right? And to influence what happens in society, and to influence what happens in your local environment.
And how do you do that?
I mean, say for example that you own a big company working on sort of building like housing and so on. Then you have the possibility of influencing what that area will look like and what that area will be built for. So if that will be designed for, families, or for singles, or for certain activities and not for others. For example, there are many more boys playing football than girls. But there is almost an equal amount of girls playing basketball as boys playing basketball in Sweden. I mean, you should probably make sure that there are, enough spaces for boys to perform sports as for girls to perform sports.
That is a wonderful takeaway. Yeah, it's like super practical and so easy to understand.
Yeah, and I think that this goes through all type of sort of consumption areas. I mean, if you're a man starting a company, it's easier for you to understand how you would use certain products, right? And you design the product in a manner that sort of suits you and your main target group maybe. But that makes products designed for men and not for women, for example. And I think you can sort of, you want societies to be designed for everyone.
Yeah, of
as
course
well as you
do.
want, important products to be designed for everyone. And then obviously, I mean, if you go back to parents again, it's extremely important to share parental leave equally. That's sort of the basis of how household work will be split up between you as partners going forward. So if you don't share parental leave, there's a high chance that you will not share time off work when your child is sick, for example. And it's often the way that, the person who spend more time at home also do more of the cleaning and more of whatever that might be. So I think it's a very important first step. And if you do decide not to share parental leave and other type of household work equally, you should be aware of the consequences in terms of your pension and in terms of your pay gap. So I would recommend then that you do monetary transfers, that you set up in a way that makes your economy more equal, even if you would have a divorce later on in life.
So, for example, setting off pension points to the other partner that's home, taking care of the home.
Yes, for example.
Yeah. But ideally, you take out your, 6 plus 3 months, and the other person takes out 6 plus 3 months.
Yes, ideally, if you're aiming to have an equal partnerships in terms of childcare and pay, yes.
What can men do?
Men in general, men in general, just as women in general, can try to affect or reduce the impact of their the stereotypes that they suffer from in their decision making. And if they are managers or if they are investors, they can then do even more. Try to sort of increase numbers of role models and such. And I think it's super important to be open-minded and to see that, women as much as men can do all of these things that has something to do with ownership. So that's a mind shift that we really need to work on. So rather than, asking what men can do and what women can do, I think, as parents, there are certain things you can do. As managers, there are certain things you can do. And as a person who wants to become more involved in their ownership that they already have sort of access to, or want to start owning things, I think you really need to find your social network. You really need to find people who are interested in, starting to buy shares, for example. And you need to buy your first share, and you need to gain knowledge and you go ahead, and then you should sort of invest a small amount every month over a long period of time. And then, if the stock market continues as it has for the last, 34 years, it will be a great investment.
When do you think we're going to have an equal ownership? How long is that going to take?
I really hope we can achieve a shift within my lifetime. But complete equality, you can't really say, basically. I don't know. It's hard to understand what the trend looks like, given that the data is so scarce. But I'm hopeful. And I really think that we can make great differences just by talking about this issue and making people aware that this is very important for the sole person, for the couple, for our companies and society.
So I'm kind of thinking, are there any numbers that you would want to get your hands on that you haven't?
There are lots of them. I mean, I would really like to research how divorces affect men and women differently, for example. If you're supposed to sort of split equally by law, but do you really? It's a question that I would really want to be able to respond to. And another one is to understand how inheritances turn out in the end. If you're a man owning a forest and you only have daughters, would you then sell off your forest before you die? Or would you let your daughters manage it, right? Or if you're, in the same situation, if you have both a son and a daughter, would you then give the forest, split the forest between them, but then the daughter sells her part to the son? Like, I would like to see how these flows actually work. And the same with, now forest was one example, but it could be companies or housing or whatever, really. And that's something that would really contribute to the understanding of why we have such unequal ownership today.
That's fascinating. I'm really curious, what are you going to write your next report about? Or maybe we don't know that.
Well, I can tell you that there's going to be a next report. And it's going to focus on more of a local deep dive in properties and natural resources and sort of areas that are important for sustainability. And that's also been an important topic now during Corona, when we talked about what should we be sort of self-reliant in certain aspects and so on as a country. So I think it will be very interesting.
I bet. I'm so looking forward to it. Please send us information when you have more. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. And thank you for doing the research. Because I think it is so phenomenal that research are the hard numbers that we can take with us and point to when people go off into opinion land.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And it's been a pleasure talking to you.
So this episode is in partnership with ProgressData.io, a research-based tool for HR managers to measure what matters when it comes to gender and diversity, pay gap, and creating parity reports with actionable improvement suggestions. That's ProgressData.io.